this saying of the Lord with regard to the sins of the paralytic being forgiven, coupled with what follows, authority given to man to forgive sins on earth, has been taken up by the Christian centuries as an indication of already embryonically the way in which the Lord would implant in the mystical body his own power to remit sins, and does not go directly to the Father without passing through the mystical body. It's all one. To do so is to become precisely a Protestant. It's not quite so simple. The Church was the sacrament par excellence of the salvation of the human race, and it is an extension of the life of the Son of Man on earth. He identifies himself with his own mystical body. That comes through in the power he gives to teach, and the power also to rule. Bishops have his authority, vox Christi. The bishop is the voice of Christ for us. In fact, this very day I was writing to our new bishop to explain that I'd be away for a few days in Italy to do a wedding. He has to know, because the hermit makes his vows directly to the bishop, and he's the abbot. And therefore that supernatural vision of the bishop is important. He's not just what he looks like. Christ is in him and speaks in him. And the power then to sanctify. This applies also, of course, to any priest who has the faculties to hear and absolve. By the way, that doesn't always follow. Every priest ordained has it in his person, but he also has in his person the possibility to confirm. But he will rarely do so, because only a parish priest has automatically the power to confirm a child about to die, because a child about to die is given all the sacraments, and therefore the parish priest has it. But he cannot delegate it just like that, and it's the bishop alone who can unbind the possibility of confirming within a presbyter. So too, with regard to exorcism, the priest has it but may not exercise it. It has to be unbound by the bishop. And to do so without that is to go in head-on collision with old Nick, who will take advantage of disobedience and presumption. And also with regard then to the faculty to absolve. Because in France, in the contemplative life, many are ordained, the expression is ad missam, to the Mass. All they will do is a daily celebration of the sacred mysteries. It's particularly what one finds in the contemplative houses. Only a certain number of experienced priests are given the faculties in these monasteries. Now, when it comes to the ordination in the diocese, what happens is this. The bishop will give the faculties, and the person who is placed as a pastor of souls has them automatically, both as parish priest and as curate. They can be withdrawn, however, for any motive which draws attention, e.g. a person who is indiscreet and starts to spill the beans and talk about people's sins. He can find himself suddenly not allowed to hear confessions. That could happen. But with other situations then, the bishop has to add this bit, and there's a reason for it historically. The bishop is the absolver in the early church. It was done in a different way in the early centuries. It was the major sins, apostasy, adultery, murder, and things of that order, which would place the person in the category of a public penitent. And they will be reconciled after a process of public penance on Holy Thursday. by the bishop. Therefore, they were known and visible. As time went on, actually in this part of the world, there was an impetus through the monastic world to have auricular confession, the year. And it was private, and it was linked also with the importance of the soul friend who would, by knowing what was going on in the heart, follow a soul through and invite towards greater sanctity. It was considered a gift given by the Holy Spirit, spiritual paternity. And this eventually, from the 6th century, 7th century onwards, became predominant and came back then to the main body of Europe and the Church as a whole as the norm. At the early stages of it, it was tariffed. There were certain penances prescribed for certain sins. Now, the whole point is this. It's still going back to the exercise of the bishop's role as what? Judge. The bishop was acting as judge, and actually, if one looks at early architecture, the basilica, which comes from pre-Christian times, has the bishop in the apse. The cathedra of the bishop is in the apse, in the very place where the judge would have been in that same basilica structure in pre-Christian times. He is sitting in judgment. And that is actually essentially what a priest is doing in his name on a local level when he hears confession. Therefore, certain things have to be present for the integrity of the sacrament. Knowledge, the sins, the grave sins have to be known in number and kind. If one doesn't know the number, one says many times, to have some idea at least. The judgment then has to be given, and the following penance has to be executed. As time went on, that order of things was reversed, because with auricular confession and absolution coming in on the spot, the penance could be done after absolution, but it's a kind of anticipation. Therefore, mentally, one has to have the resolve to do it. It has to be done at least by the next confession. So, it makes sense that the bishop, in delegating his own power to judge, is actually, therefore, going to exercise his own episcopal authority directly, and will not do that if he's not giving the faculties, because it's only embryonically in the person of the priest to absolve. The other bit has to follow because it's the bishop's role. Now, this actually is curious insofar as certain things are attached to the priest's person that cannot go away. If a priest leaves the priesthood, whether he's laicized or not, that is to say, whether he just goes into sin and abandons the ministry, or whether he goes through channels and gets the thing regularized, essentially he is still very much a priest. And Holy Mother Church recognizes that in giving him again the possibility and the invitation to exercise it in one situation alone. Because our Holy Mother the Church is a good mother, she does all she possibly can to save a soul at the last point. In fact, this very evening before coming here, I gave absolution with the plenary indulgence given to a priest to a person who was about to die. It was in a nursing home there. There was a nun who, not Sister Sumter, another one, who may be at the point of death. And I gave her this special formula, which the Church then is very generous with and takes on all board all the possible consequences of sin. Hugely generous in articulo mortis. But this is the point. If a person has left the priesthood and finds himself, for instance, suddenly involved in being a witness to an accident on the road, and the person is petering out in death, and he's a laicized priest, he is invited by the church to go up to that person and do all he can to save that soul, because the church is concerned with souls, and therefore he may, even as a laicized priest, absolve again. Some years ago, the Holy Father, St. John Paul II, was somewhere in the Vatican area, and he saw this tramp, up to no good, hanging around somewhere there as a down and out near the Vatican. Something in the heart of the good pontiff inspired him to approach him and ask what he was up to and where he was from. It turned out that he was a priest who'd left the priesthood years previously and had got into bad ways and was on the brink. Something in the heart of John Paul II nudged him to say immediately, "Could I ask you a favour? Would you please hear my confession?" Being Supreme Pontiff, he could of course give all the faculties just like that, but he did. And that act of exercising again his priestly ministry was such a spark in the depth of his priestly soul that he came back with a vengeance to his priesthood and started off where he left off before. Once a priest, always a priest. That applies also in the beyond. It can unfortunately apply also in the beyond in negative, increasing a person's damnation. This is for us, as it happens, a big day in our local area in Wales. If you've ever been to my little hermitage and to the larger of the two chapels, you will have seen on the wall a big picture of a martyr with a chalice in his hand. It's painted by a Benedictine, now dead. He was Benedictine of Prynich. And it's a picture of a Benedictine martyr who died on this very day, 1610. His story is this. He was from our area, he spoke Welsh of course, and he was influenced, because he was himself brought up as an Anglican in the state church, by an old monk who had stuck around in the monastery near where we live, Cistercian ruin. The monastery had been closed forcibly by state authority, but he was around out of force of habit, quietly praying away, this old Cistercian. Come here, Rabbi. And he somehow influenced this young man without any fuss or bother, just he was a presence. It niggled him. John Roberts was sent to Oxford. He was in St. John's, but actually we celebrated the Sacred Mysteries in the year of his anniversary in 2010. And he, from there, eventually went to Paris, to Notre Dame, and he asked discreetly, because his conscience was niggling him, if he could come back to the roots of Wales as a Catholic. He therefore had the notion that he had somehow to do something big, given the crisis of the period. He got involved with others of the same ilk who were interested in perpetuating the lamp of the monastic life in exile. He went to Valladolid and with others maintained in exile the flame of the old venerable English congregation of Benedictines. This was in parallel with what others did at Dieu-Loire in France. Those from Dieu-Loire eventually became those of Ampleforth, and those in Valladolid eventually became those of Downside. And they had all the privileges of the old congregation. In fact, those of Ampleforth trace it back through one monk, Sigebert Buckley, who was a monk of Westminster Abbey, and he gave the rites of succession to 2 young novices. So it carried on. Eventually, they came back, and to this day, these old houses are very much aware of their roots. It's called the Venerable English Congregation for a good reason. It's one of the oldest in the world. It goes on, and they're aware of all the tradition, the sanctity, the heritage that has come through, and it's serious stuff. Beautiful liturgy, big intellectual work, great literature, and direction of souls. Openness also to people, parishes. My own parish was run by Ampleforth, 6 or 7 monks. But then also there was the internal transmission of traditions and power. I just finished with one story. It's true. And being in contact with them, I got it on the grapevine. It's Christmas time nearly, so it's relevant. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. It was in Downside Abbey, years ago. There was a priest who wasn't a monk, but he was on retreat and he'd just been ordained. Notice that bit, he'd just been ordained. So, in the freshness of his priesthood, he asked if he could celebrate on some altar at Christmas at night. And in those days, it was still 3 masses, one after the other. Now they have to be separated. Midnight, dawn and day. So, there were so many priests and monks around that he had a job to find an altar. But the sacristan had a quick look round. He found one altar tucked away he could give him in the big abbey church, and also a chalice that he could spare. So he gave him this little chalice, and it was small. Off he went with himself and celebrated quietly. Started off all right, and then he got a bit puzzled. He started to hear noises. They got louder. They got alarmingly louder. There were noises of a big crowd, crying and roaring. They got alarmingly loud. Carried on and got to the Agnus Dei. All, of course, in silence, just him and the angels at his private altar. And at the Agnus Dei, it suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Bizarre. So he carried on and celebrated the other 2 and went to bed. The following morning, the sacristan came up to him discreetly and said, "Father, how do you get on?" "Well, you must know, a bizarre experience." Explained what happened. And the sacristan quietly added, "Well, actually, dear Father, I was a bit of a hurry last night. I couldn't explain the whole story behind that chalice. It's like this. I gave you a special chalice, you know. It's what we call the persecution chalice. It was used all through the centuries, yes, when there was an urgency, an emergency, and we had to celebrate it in secret. And at one point it was celebrated during terror in France, in prison, yes, in Britain. And it was being celebrated by a young priest who had just been ordained and was celebrating his first Christmas in prison, and had the use of this chalice to do so illegally and secretly. And as he was doing so, a person was being taken to the guillotine. And as he was celebrating, he was being guillotined, and there was a great crowd following him. And at the Agnus Dei, his head fell. And we know that if a priest uses this chalice in his first Christmas Mass after being ordained, he will hear it again. So I thought, you might like the experience. And off he went with himself. And when we were together, I was being told this, a group of us young people around one of the Venerable Benedictine Fathers, and one of them, the father who was telling the story, looked discreetly in my direction and said, "I haven't yet found anyone to see if actually it still happens." Hint, hint. Unfortunately, when I was being ordained, I was not able to get back because my superior had commanded me to go straight back from Ireland, where I was, to Rome and get back straight away to the doctorate. So I had to obey. At the time I was under obedience helping in a parish in Rome, and not able to get back for my first Christmas, celebrated quietly in a parish in Rome. However, I am quite convinced, because I did actually, last time I was in contact with the victims of Downside, I was at Downside one time, and I asked about the persecution chalice, and with a little twinkle in their eye, the young monks told me, oh yes, it's in the strong room. It has to have the abbot's permission to be seen, but it was there. So that's our treasure. And there are big chunks of the martyrs at Downside, arms and legs, and one big one is actually St. John Roberts, who was doing what we're doing right now, and was at the altar, and there was a big knock at the door. Bang! 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 Open up in the name of the King! Bang! 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 And if you start the sacred mysteries, you can't stop, you're not allowed to. So he got as far as the last gospel, and the door crashed down. Ah! Caught in the act. A few days later, he was hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, the same Tyburn tree as St. Oliver Plunkett, the last of a great army, who knew